Okay, everyone. So thank you so much for joining tonight. We are going to have probably what I think is going to be the most fun and brilliant drawing from history workshop that we've ever done. We've been doing this for 2 years, just over 2 years now. And I think that tonight is going to be particularly good because we're going to put together so many different influences that made up Rubens's main sources of inspiration that really projected him forward in his artwork. Okay, so welcome to part 3 of Drawing from History on Rubens. Our series on Rubens is dynamic eclecticism because of his eclectic range of influences that he engaged with and channeled into his own unique vision. And they're not just painterly inspirations, but also sculptural, also literary, and also philosophical, as we shall see today. Today is really exciting. We're going to look at Rubens's development up until 1610. With the new format of the Drawing from History workshops, we've been doing these series and we've been looking very deeply at an artist and individual stages of their development. And so while they are broad, they do cover a broad space of time within that artist's career. They're also they go quite deeply into certain aspects. And so that's why we're going to cut off at around 1610 with Rubens and then do the rest of his career in subsequent series on Rubens. The next series is going to be on Caravaggio, and we're going to be looking at Caravaggio's early development up until, well, he only lives until 1610. He's born in 1571 and he dies in 1610. So we might actually be able to squeeze in all of Caravaggio's. We might do a series for his whole sort of timeline. Actually, that's what I'm going to aim to do in the next series. But with Rubens, he has a much longer career, which lasts over 50 years. He's active from the 1590s up until 1640. And so we're going to be focusing on this period up until 1610 in this conclusion to the series. And we're going to be looking, first of all, at what Rubens sees in Italy, and we're going to tie in his influences from classical antiquity, from contemporary art, the contemporary artwork that he was seeing when he was in Italy, and also artwork from the previous 2 generations of Italian painters in Venice. Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I'll give a brief recap while I'm talking through the introduction, and then we're going to get right into it. We're going to be looking at lots of different things today. Titian, Tintoretto, Michelangelo. We'll be looking at classical sculpture, and we'll be looking also at Caravaggio, because these are all very, very important things to understanding how Rubens, reached his own visual language, achieved his own kind of visual language, and how he put it all together. And we're also going to be looking at some of his drawings, which we haven't done yet, which is going to be very exciting. So enjoy this whole workshop. Okay, it's going to be very, very fun. So his apprenticeship concludes in 1598, and that's when he becomes a member of the Antwerp Painters Guild of St. Luke. We've covered that, and we're going to be moving on today. Last week, we looked a lot at his artistic education from when he was trained by the 3 main teachers of painting that he had in Antwerp when he was a youngster, which concluded with his, being an assistant rather than an apprentice of Otto van Veen, with whom he remained until 1600. And that was really the conclusion of his first Antwerp period, and he goes off to Italy thereafter. This painting that we looked at last week, which is the Battle of the Amazons, and we've looked at another of these early genre paintings from the 1590s in previous workshops within this series, such as the Judgment of Paris, which he completed around about the time of his entry into the Guild of St. Luke. They're examples, these early paintings are examples of him assimilating a wide range of different influences and working quite independently, with quite an independent and autonomous ability to interact and to channel his ideas that he's sourcing from various different places. Okay, so we've got here works like this, the Battle of the Amazons, which he completed with Jan Bruegel the Elder. And it shows him assimilating a broad range of influences from engravings of Raphael's designs, and having seen Leonardo's cartoons of equestrian combat, but also classical sculpture. And if I just do this, or maybe that, buttons, you will see that the Laocoon, okay, it's a sculpture that I mentioned last week in relation to this painting. We can see Hercules here with two Amazons, he's wrestling with them. And I mentioned to you last week that in the workshop of Otto van Veen and in his artistic education more generally, he would have seen models, engravings, and designs that were based on the Laocoon, the sculpture that was rediscovered in 1506 in a vineyard outside of out of the city of Rome, which became the most electrifyingly exciting and widely celebrated sculpture from classical antiquity to have been unearthed in the Renaissance. Okay, so we can see him directly referencing the Laocoon there. Okay, with his Hercules. Okay, during the labors of Hercules. And if we look at another example, which I did mention last week, which I didn't include in the presentation, we have here a Discuri. And the Discuri on the bottom right is on public display in Rome. There are lots of drawings and designs and engravings and possibly even models of the Discuri. And that would have been something that Rubens would have seen. And as you can see, he's adapting both pre-existing models into his own composition, but modifying them to some extent to suit his own compositional ideas. And he's doing that at a very, very early stage in his life. And I did mention Giorgioni's Sleeping Venus, and she seems to make an appearance down there at the front with that dead Amazon archer. Okay, so lots of references here already at this early stage. So what happens with Rubens after this is he leaves Antwerp for Italy. And to be precise, he left Antwerp for Italy on the 9th of May, 1600, as recommended by his teacher, Otto van Veen. Rubens in the 1620s, he then, I mean, in 1620s, he's really becomes one of the most established artists in Europe by that point. He's known across the entire continent by the 1620s. Okay, but in this period, he's just formulating a completely new way of interacting with contemporary art, as well as his literary heritage, and in his as well as his literary education and with his training. Okay, so the various different sources that he was interacting with in his training. During the 1620s, he was in Spain for a brief period. He spent 9 months at the Alcázar in Madrid during the 1620s, and he would then recommend that Philip IV send Velazquez to Italy, just like Otto van Veen recommended that Rubens go and spend some time in Italy to see the Italian masterworks firsthand. Okay, so he echoes the advice that was given to him by his teacher to Diego Velazquez. Okay, so the young Velazquez, who was in his early 20s when he's court painter of Philip IV, when strangely Sir Peter Rubens is at the Alcázar in Madrid. He recommends that Velazquez goes to Italy. Okay, so that's something that he passes on and encourages another young artist to go and do. What he first sees in Italy, one of the first paintings he sees or strikes him in Italy, is this remarkable painting by Titian. Okay, so Titian is, as you all know, regarded by many as one of the greatest painters of all time. And that's because of his widespread reputation, which is a justly acquired reputation across Europe for being able to bring narratives from classical antiquity and from Judeo-Christianity to life in a very vivid and striking naturalistic way on a monumental scale. And Titian's genre paintings and poesy, as he referred to some of them, which related to the epic poetry of Ovid and Catullus, these poesy paintings were incredibly popular and culturally significant. And here we've got the Ecce Homo. The Ecce Homo, where Pilate is displaying Christ to a crowd, and the crowd are demanding that Christ be crucified. And this is one of Titian's major works of the 1540s. It's during the Manneristic period in which Titian was, it did partake in the Manneristic movement to an extent. And so what I mean by that is these really dynamic compositions with lots of figures, giving a sense of action and drama, and not abiding by conventional norms of perspective. Here we're looking up at Christ and we're looking to the left to find Christ. He's not in the middle. That's the sort of things that distinguish Manneristic paintings from more conventional high Renaissance paintings, where important figures like Christ and the Virgin occupy center stage. Mannerists deconstructed the conventions of the high Renaissance, especially revolving around composition and perspective, as well as the figurative delineation of the human form, to elongate and to contort and to create more expressive and dynamic figures by diverging from Vitruvian proportion, which had been the standard norm during the Renaissance proper and into the High Renaissance. So we have Pilate, we have the Doge there in red, we have an Ottoman knight, we have a knight of the Holy Roman Empire there with that, you know, a kite shield wouldn't have been in use at that point, but a shield is something, you know, a kite shield is what we associate with Normans, but a kite shield is quite an icon, isn't it? It's a striking image, and that double-faced eagle is the symbol of the Holy Roman Empire, which is at the vanguard of Catholic Europe in that time. And Titian became a very, very important figure in the Holy Roman Empire within its artistic culture because of his close relationship with Charles V of Spain, who was Holy Roman Emperor in the 1530s. So Ecce Homo, this is something that would have made a huge impact on Rubens. Okay, so I'm just showing you these so that you get an idea of what he saw. And we're going to look at this painting by Titian, and then we're going to look at this painting by Tintoretto now. Actually, we're going to move on to Tintoretto. I think I've said enough about the Ecce Homo. Oh, no, I haven't. I just have to look at my notes and find that I've actually got more. So he reaches Venice, where he sees Titian's Ecce Homo, and which was painted in 1543, which was painted for Giovanni de Anna, who was a Flemish merchant living in Venice. And that's why this was one of the first paintings which Rubens saw in Venice, is because that there would have been connections. There would have been, there was a network of Flemish merchants and artists and established people who had connections with Otto van Veen. Okay, so Otto van Veen, being Rubens's teacher, enabled Rubens to interact with this network of successful Flemish burghers in Venice. And it also speaks of Flemish taste, actually. The Ecce Homo was not a popular taste in Italian art, was not a popular theme in Italian painting at the time. And it speaks to the rise of Flemish social success across Europe at that time as well. You know, you have a Flemish merchant purchasing a major work from Titian in the 1540s, when Titian is the greatest painter in all of Europe, the greatest painter in all of Christendom. So this is a hugely significant painting and would have made an enormous impression on the young Peter Paul Rubens. Again, within that Manneristic framework. painter who developed on Titian's ideas was Tintoretto, and this painting is on the ground floor of the amazing Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice. They're a sort of hospital and church brotherhood, confraternity in Venice, who sponsored hospitals and that sort of thing in Venice. And Tintoretto's decorations of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice is absolutely explosive. It's completely and utterly remarkable. Anyone who's ever painted in oils, anyone who's ever attempted to paint a figure in oils or to complete a canvas in oils, to step foot in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco is like visiting some sort. It makes such an impression that it's unforgettable. So this is the Annunciation. We've all seen Annunciation paintings, but none that look quite like this. So the Mannerism, which is more dynamic, which decenters the primary subjects and creates a dynamic vortex of movement, is kind of really pushed to an extreme in this painting. It's an Annunciation. It's usually a peaceful scene where the Virgin is really arrested with shock at the appearance of Gabriel, because he's appearing to tell her that the book of Isaiah is about to come true and that it's her who's going to bear the child who is going to become the man of sorrows. Okay, so the book of Isaiah is where that prophecy is told, and that's what she's reading. That's the book she's got on her lap there. And Gabriel appears to her and says, "You're going to be the mother of God." And so we have the Holy Spirit appearing as well here in making an appearance as that sparkling bird there, that dove there. That's the Holy Spirit. So, but this dilapidated kind of environment is completely. I think that this is utterly unprecedented. This painting, it's strikingly direct in its application, and it is taking what one may have seen in Venice at that time, with the architecture crumbling because of Venice wasn't the most violent city-state in Italy at the time. Places like Milan was constantly under threat from the French, and Florence was always at war with its neighbors. But when building works are undergoing, and when buildings get damaged, you see this sort of thing. And he's taking something that is from the everyday into one of the most sacred images in Christian art, the Annunciation, with this enormous horde of cherubim accompanying Gabriel there, as though they are lots of cupids. So completely remarkable. And also this use of chiaroscuro is unprecedented as well. The use of light and shade to enhance the narrative and to enhance the luminosity of certain aspects of the painting, to guide your eye around in a spiral, is, for the lighting effect to create that sense of movement, is quite unique to Venetian painting at this particular time. And it's got something to do with the light, the way that artists perceived and experienced light in Venice itself. And you would see that if you were to go there and see how, when you're walking around the streets of Venice, you see light reflecting upwards from the water, because the water makes little paths all the way, and you're crossing bridges all the time. And the light, the luminosity of Venice creates, you're all probably going to want to book flights to Venice after this workshop, but and I wouldn't blame you, and I want to book a flight to Venice, but it is an amazing place just to walk around and see and be there, and you can see why and how the light of Venice itself would have inspired Tintoretto. And it's interesting how Tintoretto's developments, as well as Titian's ideas, and also Giorgioni's ideas, would influence quite profoundly on Caravaggio, which we will be seeing quite shortly. So we've looked at Tintoretto, his dynamism, his chiaroscuro, and his drama. And he used what he learned from Titian and created these more vivid and dynamic compositions. He was a categorical maverick, Tintoretto was. And in every aspect, his paintings are more extreme. Rubens doesn't stay in Venice forever. He does, in fact, make his way down to Florence. Oh, excuse me. He does, in fact, also go to Florence and sees firsthand the work of Michelangelo. And I don't think that there could have been any artist more famous, important, and influential than Michelangelo, even Leonardo and Raphael, possibly. So in terms of, especially with the art of the human form, the art of the human figure, the expressive nude figure, this is a very early example of Michelangelo responding to classical sculpture. And in this remarkable Battle of the Centaurs, which Michelangelo made at the start of the 1490s, when he was in the household of Lorenzo the Magnificent and being influenced by Bertoldo di Giovanni, the in-house sculpture leader of the sort of education in sculpting in Lorenzo's garden, in the sculpture garden. You can see Michelangelo adopting the use of the dynamic and closely packed composition of male nudes. And it's evident that he's looking at Bertoldo di Giovanni, who was quite a pioneer in his own right of having this congested composition of figures, and also looking very closely at classical relief sculpture. But here he is actually making the relief far deeper than was usual in classical times. So this carving is a response, but also to some extent a commentary, a humanistic critique almost of classical sculpture by creating a deeper sense of relief in this carving and a more closely and densely packed and also visceral composition. It's a densely packed movement of flesh on this in this carving, which is totally remarkable. Okay, so people who had done relief carvings prior to Michelangelo, the reliefs had been far shallower. He was very familiar with Lorenzo Ghiberti. Some of them are quite high relief on the Gates of Paradise. Also Donatello, slightly later than Ghiberti. He was very famous for the very, very shallow relief, except if you look at his Cavalcanti Annunciation, that's in very high relief. So there are lots of examples that we can look at, which Michelangelo would have been familiar with. But this is remarkable. This is very much in the wake of Pollaiolo and Verrocchio, with the more anatomically considered nude and also the more dynamic interactive nude within the single frame. We think of Pollaiolo. His generation of artists were the earliest to really, that we know of, that really started to examine cadavers and to create dynamic compositions of nudes in action. Okay, so Rubens saw this piece in the Casa Buonarroti, where it was, and he also went to the Church of San Lorenzo, the Medici Church, and saw the Medici Chapel, where Michelangelo had day and night, and dusk and dawn, and the fantastic portrait monuments of some of the lesser known Medici. So these sculptures, he drew them. Okay, and there is a drawing by Rubens in the Boymans Museum of this relief, and I will include that in the next series on on Rubens, okay, but we're going to be looking at some even more exciting drawings by Rubens today. So here, I mean, this ties in very closely with Rubens because there's a particular sculpture that Rubens found particularly inspiring. And it happens to be the very same sculpture which inspired the Ignudi on the Capella Sistina ceiling. And what Michelangelo did here while he was working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling between 1508 and 1512 was create a range of variations of the pose which the Belvedere torso may have been in, and produced designs of figures that represented Michelangelo's idea of the perfect human form, the perfect male form, in order to telegraph a theological idea of God's most perfect creation. And he based these designs around the Belvedere torso, which is an ancient sculpture from classical Greece, from ancient Greece. And so this figure here, I mean, it would be very big, okay, larger than life size because it's all the way up there on the ceiling. I don't have the exact measurement of this figure, but I presume it's, you know, over 2 meters tall, I presume. Okay, it's in fresco on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And this is what he sees when he visits Rome. Okay, so now we're in Rome with Rubens. And we saw in the previous workshops some of the, you know, the effect that some of what he saw in Rome had on him. We're going to look a bit deeper now. And we didn't really talk too much about Michelangelo, but the Belvedere torso provided the stimulus or the primary inspiration for the Ignudo on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which exist outside of the main panels which tell the narrative of the Old Testament. So he's inspired by the Belvedere torso. And that is the Belvedere torso, which is in the Vatican. We do have a signature on it in Greek, Apollonius, but we don't know exactly who made the sculpture, but we do have a good case to make that the sculpture comes from the 1st century BCE and may well be Apollonius's copy of a earlier Greek original, okay, from Hellenic Greece. So let's have a look at these two side by side then. You can see very clearly here in this slide exactly how much Michelangelo drew from the Belvedere torso, but wouldn't just copy these things. He wouldn't just mimic the Belvedere torso. He would borrow and adapt and morph and transform and invent. The classical sculptures were a source for these artists to invent and create their own ideas, but from a familiar point of reference, which other people would have been able to detect in their artworks, as we can here. Okay, so how about Caravaggio then? In the same time of Rubens arriving in Rome and seeing the Belvedere torso and seeing the paintings of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, he would have seen the final judgment, and he would have seen the Sistine Chapel. He would have also been able to go to the Contarelli Chapel in the Chiesa di San Luigi dei Francesi in Rome, okay, and seen the free paintings relating to St. Matthew. This is the martyrdom of St. Matthew, which Caravaggio painted just a couple of years before Rubens arrived in Rome. Okay, so Rubens arrived in Rome in 1601, and this painting was made and then publicly displayed and revealed in 1600. So it's contemporary art. It's really, 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 really contemporary art that Rubens is now seeing, as well as all of these great historical models. Okay, so with Caravaggio, Rubens, for the first time, encountered something entirely different. Seeing Caravaggio for Rubens would have been like nothing else he'd seen before. He would have known about Titian's greatness. He would have known, he knew about Mannerism, and he knew about genre painting. But no one can prepare you for Caravaggio. He knew about classical sculpture. He knew about how to conjure a narrative from Christian stories telling, or from Greek and Roman mythology. He'd been trained by a genre painter, Otto van Veen. He'd seen lots of models of classical sculpture and engravings from the High Renaissance, and there would have been collections that he would have been able to visit in Antwerp. But for Rubens in 1601, seeing paintings like this would have been completely different. He would have been totally unprepared for this. He encounters in this something utterly radical, and a radical departure from both High Renaissance and Mannerism, a real departure from the High Renaissance and from Mannerism, and the aesthetics therein. There's nothing manneristic about this composition, and it's such a departure from the High Renaissance. So perhaps you'd like a brief background on Caravaggio to help us make sense of this painting. He's born in 1571, and he's apprenticed at the age of 13 to Pertezzano. And Simone Pertezzano was a great teacher, actually, and a great draftsman. Then when he's 20, in 1592, he comes to Rome for the first time, because Caravaggio is originally from Milan. And he trains under Lorenzo Carli and then Antiveduto Grammatica. And these two painters are genre painters, okay, within a manneristic tradition. Caravaggio, yeah, he's trained by genre painters who are manneristic and leaning, and he's first trained by Pertezzano, who is a Lombard painter, supposedly trained in Venice. He also draws from Giorgione quite heavily, and Tintoretto and Titian. And there's an interesting link with Caravaggio and Giorgione, because Giorgione didn't rely on an underdrawing before applying paint. He painted directly onto the canvas, and that's something that we know that Caravaggio did. Painted not just directly onto the canvas, but painted from life. And that is really one of the most significant ways in which Caravaggio becomes such a stark departure from all historical painters within the history of Western art. And if you think about the tradition that he really relates to, or is evolving out from, that tradition in Western painting spans all the way from Giotto up to Titian, and then the later Mannerists. And this is utterly and completely new. He creates poses that are realistic, human, and natural, to show shock in such a spontaneous way, and horror in the poses, in the way that these figures are reacting, and the vulnerability in that figure being flung to the floor. That's a saint being flung down to the floor, about to be killed. And the horror, the shock, the recoil in the other figures is so believable. as though he'd actually observed these expressions in real life and then painted them. That's what makes Caravaggio so remarkable and so different. He's looking at human behavior. They're believable. They're even familiar. We've seen people act in a shocked way. Say if you're in a park and you see a dog go for another dog and it's shocking, and your hands fly up in shock. These are things that are familiar in daily life, and he's bringing those elements that are familiar, that are recognizable, that are believable into his paintings of the most elevated subjects within Christian art. These are elements from everyday contemporary life, which he is integrating into his paintings. That's what makes him so new and different from everything else that came before.
John, I have a question.
Diana, blimey, you made me jump. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's right.
My question is...
I was totally in the zone then.
Oh, sorry.
It's all right, go for it. It's okay. It's all right. It's all right. Do it.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question about that is, how do you account for the unique way that he approached the same subject matter in his formation? Was it a question of his education, or was it a question of the way he saw the world, or his family, his environment? I mean, you can account for a lot of the things in the decadent period with opium and absinthe, but I don't think this was the case with Caravaggio. How do you account for that in his formation?
With Caravaggio and him doing something starkly different and unique in his development, in his 20s, he was, it's got some economic reasons. And there was growing in Rome at that time an open market for painting, and he would deliberately paint things that were provocative to catch the eye of potential patrons, and he was quite successful at that. This was his first major public commission that made him very famous immediately in 1600. By 1602, when he paints the Supper at Emmaus, his first version, he's very, 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 very famous, and he's, it's him at a very, very high, probably the highest point of his career. If you look at earlier paintings by Caravaggio, they are real studies of human expressions and showing sort of deathly or shocked or frightened or pained human subjects. If you think of the boy being bit by a lizard, for example, the boy is recoiling back from a lizard having bitten his finger, which that's paintings in the National Gallery in London. And so it's something about the emergence of the open art market. Painting works which are not for commission frees the imagination to an extent and encourages the artist to make bold decisions and risks. So earlier, it wasn't so common for painters to paint something and without a buyer, without a pre-established buyer who was telling them what they wanted, giving them a specific brief and letting them know where the painting was going to be hung. If you have an open market and you're trying to generate some income and trying to get people to notice your work, and you do not have someone telling you that painting is going to go in a specific place, that painting is going to be for a specific purpose, I want that painting to be of a specific subject, painted in this way, then you're a bit freer to diverge from the norms. And that's what Caravaggio did. It's got the economic reasons of the sort of birth of a new kind of art market, a new way of attracting clients. But he's also very good at adapting what he's found. There are very close similarities between some of Caravaggio's paintings and some of Titian's paintings. Okay, so if I think of Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, there are really significant borrowings. There are certain things that Titian does which are subtle but have a profound impact, and that is he moves you closer to the picture frame. So that's one of the things that Titian does, in many respects, that Caravaggio does, though in many respects he's building on elements that he's already seen, that we are all familiar with, but makes them appear very strikingly different in his work, because he does very clever things with composition. look at how close we are to the figures. That wouldn't be the case in a much earlier painting. To be that close to an execution, to a martyrdom, we are less remote from the stage. It's almost though we are actually on the stage in which the scene is unfolding, and that makes the painting so much more dramatic. The chiaroscuro in Caravaggio is actually used to enhance the narrative, not just to create a sense of movement. He actually uses the light and dark as to actually enhance figurative devices. We'll be looking at this next week when we look at Caravaggio, and we've got a series on Caravaggio, and that will be the question that you've asked, which I hope I've provided something of an answer to, will be further developed in the following series on Caravaggio, Diana, which I'm hoping you're going to be taking part in.
Certo, Jonathan, certo.
Good, very good. All right, so Caravaggio. I would like to say something about Caravaggio while we're looking again at how Rubens responds. So basically, there are new things in art all the time. Okay, there are new things in art being done today. I just happen not to know what they are or really care. But there have been new things in art in every decade. You know, there's a new thing, and they're generally always controversial and divisive. And imagine being and seeing Caravaggio's works unveiled for the first time. Okay, it would be a little bit, there's such a departure from the pre-established canon that there could be a comparison made between Caravaggio and the radical departure that Caravaggio makes in the final years of the 1500s and the opening years of the 1600s. There could be a comparison made between what was happening then with Caravaggio and what was happening with Picasso and Braque in 1907. Would you have gone along with this new stuff that emerged in the beginning of the 20th century? The whole, world of educated people who enjoyed art in 1907 were wondering what on earth was going on and what on earth Picasso was going to do next. It was incredibly divisive. It was such a departure from 19th and early 20th century academicism. He deconstructed it and introduced a way of seeing the figure from various different perspectives at the same time. That had been touched on earlier, to a certain extent by Cézanne, but with Picasso and Braque, that is a huge, a paradigmatic departure, to put it lightly, So would you have gone along with it? Rubens, in this time as a youngster, has the remarkable boldness, creative boldness and maturity, while having been brought up in this manneristic and genre painting and high Renaissance influence milieu and world, to see Caravaggio for being the brilliant genius that he was and integrating it immediately. So imagine if that is such a departure from everything we've seen so far, isn't it? I mean, that's remarkable. It's modern painting. And then you see this, that he does a year after having seen it. In his first major commission, The Tormenting of Christ, which is part of a 3-painting altarpiece. And not only is he integrating ideas from Caravaggio, from Titian, if you think of Ecce Homo and the staircase, there we are, and Tintoretto with the stark lighting and the dynamic, sort of closely compact figures. There's Tintoretto there, there's Titian there with the dog as well. And there's also the Caravaggio with the darkness, with the close-up sense of composition. And also the naturalistic pose of the body. That is not a Michelangelo-esque response to the seated nude. That is not a Michelangelo-esque, it's Caravaggio-esque. So he's putting all these things together in the most insanely brilliant way. It's completely unfathomable. And just look at that Christ. I mean, isn't that reminiscent also of the Belvedere torso? So he's able to not only respond to Titian, to Tintoretto, to the Belvedere torso in classical sculpture, and to Caravaggio, but he's able to morph the same subject matter along, you know, it together within this whole. He's like the ultimate visual communicator at that time. It's completely astonishing. It's creative genius to a level which is very, very rarely seen. So let's give you some proper time to draw now. I think that we need to look at an actual drawing. So there we are. Look, I'm going to give you plenty of time on this because I've not been fair. I've got too excited and put loads into this workshop because I wanted to give you a really clear sense of exactly how I feel about how brilliant this artist is. And I had to narrow it down to a few artworks that really showed his development up until 1602. We looked at the Tormenting of Christ last week, which is why we don't need to draw it again. And now I'm showing you a drawing that led up to it. We know that he saw Caravaggio's paintings, and we know that he saw the Belvedere torso. We know that he saw Michelangelo's paintings in Rome. We know that he saw Titian and Tintoretto in Venice. And here he is, sometime around 1601, drawing from the Belvedere torso in Rome. But unlike an academic artist, unlike an academician, you don't see him starting with construction lines or any of this tight methodology. There's no trace of an academic approach here. This is very much still an early modern historical approach to drawing, which is far more direct, but also far more inventive. If you look at academic drawings of casts and of sculptures, they look like drawings of casts and sculptures because the artist doesn't put invention into the drawing. He's still a young artist at this time, and they didn't have this style of mimicry that academicism would develop. It's a more humane method of drawing at this time. He doesn't just copy the effect of marble, although he does have the breakages and, you know, the buttocks that have been blasted off by something over the millennia, literally, are drawn. So we know that we're looking at a direct drawing from the Belvedere torso, but it's not drawn as though it's just a hunk of marble. It's drawn as though it is a proper drawing of a human body. It's got that electricity to it and that fleshiness and roundedness to it. He hasn't just done an academic study of cast drawing like a 20th century or that you'd see in an atelier today. This is a Renaissance drawing. It's not a Renaissance drawing because it's way after the Renaissance, but it's executed in the spirit of early modern historical drawing, which has died out now. And you can see the inventiveness because he's poised ahead on there. In historical drawing, invention makes a far greater impact on the process than in modern drawing. The artists of this period, up until academicism and, you know, 18th and 19th century classicism, artists were far more expressive in their drawings before the realist schools were established. And he has a very effective and economic way of using hatching to model the form. And that effective and extremely economic use of hatching is something that we don't really see anymore. You don't see it in atelier drawings, which are highly rendered and they're layered and layered and layered with tone. It's an example of drawing from classical sculpture in a way which is executed in a truly historical approach to drawing, when drawing was thought of in a very different way, and when drawing was approached and executed in a very different way than how we've seen for many, many years. This drawing's in the Met in New York, and on their website, their collection is made so accessible. It's fantastic. That's where I got this image from the Met Museum website, and they provide extraordinary images from their collection, including this one of their drawing by Rubens. It's quite a large drawing. It's 26 centimeters tall, and it's far wider. So if you think of 26 centimeters, that is how much bigger of an A? How big is that? So it's 26. It's a pretty big drawing. It's bigger than A4 really. I don't have any A4. It's a little bit maybe bigger than A4, and just as of the seated back. So that seated back is drawn quite large, and that, you know, look how much of the paper beneath is visible. So much of the paper itself is showing through, and that speaks of the economy in his approach. Okay, so Rubens is drawing in a very, very historical way. He's drawing very diligently and in a very detailed way, but capturing those details with astonishingly, swift and economic execution. We're also viewing the Belvedere torso very, very close up. So we know that he had time to study and draw the Belvedere torso, personally. We're getting a close personal proximity to the sculpture through his drawing, through his, we're gaining a very, very close vision of the sculpture via Rubens' his own vision. And it's very closely observed in its details and in the superficial musculature, which is rendered and modeled very effectively. This is an example, this drawing is an example of how Rubens acquired and developed on such a broad and expansive lexicon of images, of visual impressions and ideas. And I think already today we've seen, in the last hour, we have seen him assimilate so many different influences into a cohesive and coherent aesthetic. Now, drawing was a huge part of Rubens's practice, and drawing from historical artworks like we do every Monday, okay, drawing from history. Drawing from history was a huge part of Rubens's life, his approach, and the formulation of his the nurturing of his creativity and the formulation of his creative ideas, and in unlocking his own unique development. Drawing from history was fundamental to all of that. Drawing from the history of art filled his mind, and it nurtured his creative impulses through discipline and representing pre-existing things in his own creative vision, but with a tremendous deal of care to the original. And that's what this drawing is a fantastic example of. Okay. So, everyone, I hope you're enjoying the workshop so far, and I hope that you've seen lots of things that you found inspiring. And I hope that this is providing you with, a sense of energetic drawing. And I hope that something from Rubens's drawing of the Belvedere torso here is inspiring you to approach drawing the figure in a more energetic, a more energized, a more intuitive way, which is closer to the historical method, perhaps, or a historical approach, perhaps. So, Rubens didn't stay in Rome forever. He was in Rome for a while. As I mentioned at the very beginning, he goes to Italy in 1600, and by 1601 he arrives in Rome for the first time. Between 1600 and 1608, which is, this time where he's in Europe, I mean, he returns to Antwerp in 1608, but from 1600 to 1608, which is the period of time in which he makes this beautiful drawing, he is traveling around Italy and also visiting Spain. In 1603, Rubens goes to Spain as part of an embassy from Mantua, because it's the Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga of Mantua who is his employer. So he's sent as an embassy from Mantua to Philip III of Spain in 1603. And that is another important step in his creative development. Okay, so he returns in 1604 to Italy, and he travels between Mantua, Rome, Genoa, and Milan until 1608. And in 1608, he returns to Antwerp. He hears while working in Rome that his mother is unwell, and he returns to Antwerp. He travels home to Antwerp, but she's no longer. She passes away, sadly, before he's able to. She passes away days before he returns to Antwerp, but he then ends up settling in Antwerp after 1608, and on returning to Antwerp, he subsequently made a court painter to the Spanish governors of the Netherlands, which is an important institution, and he'd actually hold that post for the rest of his life. And in this series, we're going to travel next to Spain with Rubens. We've been in Rome now. We're going to travel with him to Spain. We're going to see one of his paintings from that period, and then we're going to return to Antwerp with him and look at one of the paintings that he made, which really showcases the arrival of an entirely new creative mind in its maturity in the last painting that we look at in the workshop today, and the last painting that we look at in the series on Rubens. And this has been a very, very fun series, and I can't wait for the next series on Caravaggio, which I think is probably going to be, do you know what? My pledge to you is that the next series, the one on Caravaggio, is going to be the best series ever of drawing from history. So I better get working on that. So how long have you had on this one? You've had a while. Do we need a bit longer on this one, everyone?
Yes.
Very well. So in this drawing, one thing I think you ought to do is really, really look at the neck and the position of the neck. Okay, so the neck is clearly moving towards the right, and the left shoulder is clearly higher than the right shoulder. Make sure you've started with a really nice, simple sketch of that core action as seen from the back. Make a visual note with a little shape or a circle for that 7th cervical vertebra, which is there. And look at how the angle of the shoulders would pass just below that 7th cervical vertebra, because that 7th cervical vertebra, as those of you who are Renaissance workshop apprentices will know that the seventh cervical vertebra is the last vertebra of the neck, and below that you get the start of the rib cage. Okay, and the rib cage and the top of the rib cage is very much connected to the shoulder girdle. Okay, so that line that would pass through the angle of the ribs will be below that seventh cervical vertebra. Then you want to have a clear sense of that upper mass and that tapered waist. Make sure you've got that contrast between the broad back and that tapered waist. And we will be moving on in a couple of minutes so that we can catch up with Rubens in Spain. There's a brilliant story to tell about what happens in Spain when Rubens is sent by Vincenzo Gonzaga to the court of Philip III, who was then monarch of Spain, king of Spain, and the ruler of the Habsburgs. And on the way to Spain, some of the wonderful gifts that Vincenzo Gonzaga had intended to be presented to Philip III become damaged. They were traveling by land, you see. Traveling by land is quite dangerous, and also you run the risk of damaging things, getting ill, getting robbed, falling off mountains, all sorts of things, and also things getting damaged and stolen. I suppose you run those risks, or some of them at least, when traveling by sea as well, but traveling by sea in the early modern period is much faster and more affordable than traveling by land. But in a couple of minutes, we're going to see what happens in Spain. The hatching is incredibly economic. There are just a few layers of tone. And he uses a lot of straight lines with the chalk. And then when the chalk gets less sharp, he uses it for outshading to make some of the highlights show more. There's also use of white chalk. The paper hasn't been prepared. The paper would have been quite smooth, I imagine. I think this is quite a smooth sheet of paper. During the 15th and 16th centuries, perhaps earlier, especially in the first half of the 16th century, up until the 1560s, it was very common for artists to work on paper that had been prepared with a ground, whether or not they're working in metal point. The reason for that is because it would create a smoother paper. It would create a smoother surface, and a smooth surface enables you to get finer lines. Just imagine drawing on watercolor paper with a soft graphite pencil. You won't get sharp, distinct, and clear lines. You would get very granular marks. This approach to drawing, this historical approach to drawing, which is very much rooted in Renaissance practice, is traditionally executed and really depends, the execution of this approach to drawing really depends on your ability to generate direct, clean, clear, and distinct lines, because it suits the methodology. And so they would prepare the paper, which could be very absorbent, quite porous, and so they'd want a very smooth paper, and they'd often even polish it with a burnishing stone once they had put the ground on the paper. And the sorts of pigments that they would use would facilitate a very ivory-like finish. And they would use bone ash as one of the primary pigments for preparing the ground on paper, because that was a very hard particle. It's a pigment which you wouldn't use in other media because it's ash, and ash is very high in alkaline. It's got a very, very alkaline constitution, and so if you mix it with oil, you know what's going to happen. You'll saponify, because alkali plus a fat binder will saponify, it will create soap. That's how soap's made. Alkali plus fat is soap. So you wouldn't use, you could use it as a ground for paper when you were binding it in a a protein or collagen based glue, but not in an oil or tempera binder, because the tempera has, egg, and egg is, the egg yolk has fat in it, which would saponify. So you wouldn't want that. But the paper here is very smooth, and that is why the lines are not as sharp. Okay, the paper is smooth, but it hasn't got a polished ground, and so that's why the lines are not as sharp, although he is diligently sharpening his sanguine in order to get fine enough marks. But when the sanguine is less sharp, he's using it for the outshading and developing some nice dark qualities in the shadows. 3 layers of shading, really. The first layer is incredibly general. The second layer is more analytic of particular undulations. And then the final layer of shading is the accents within the shadows to create that more 3-dimensional quality of relief. And then the highlights in white chalk on top in the reflective areas are incredibly effective to create that light, feeling of light. It's incredible. So that's the type of red chalk that he was using. It's sanguine, and he would have cut it into little pieces, okay, and held it in one of these holders like that. And the type of white chalk, stuff like that, that's sort of natural white chalk. I'll go and get some more from Norfolk when I go in summer. So everyone, we're going to move on now. Not sanguine, that doesn't come from Norfolk. So let's have a look at what happens next. So, oh blimey, we're still in Rome. The Laocoon, very important. So the Laocoon and his sons, as I mentioned earlier, that was discovered in 1506 in a vineyard outside of the center of Rome. And this is that period where he's devouring these classical sculpture, like the Belvedere torso here and the Laocoon here. He also looks at the Farnese Hercules, the old centaur with the Cupid on his back. They're all very important to him, and he uses them as models for his drawings and would integrate aspects of them into his own work. He was familiar with the Laocoon already, but it was, seeing it for the first time, he would have been compelled to draw it and to have a drawing from the original, since it was so important. And if we look at this drawing compared to the actual Laocoon, just look at that. I mean, his drawing is so brilliant. He's such an extraordinary draftsman. He's looking at it slightly off center towards the left, because as you can see, he has that knee in full foreshortening. Okay, whereas here we're off to the side ever so slightly. So he's from a slightly different perspective. And also it has, at this point, when he's drawing it, it has a restored arm, which was stretching outwards. And it's quite different now. That restoration has been removed. Also, that right arm of one of Laocoon's sons has been restored, and that restoration has also been removed back to to leave it more open, so that we're not in conservation. The ethics of conservation now is to retain as closely as possible the original intentions of the artist, rather than imposing subsequent interpretations on that artwork. Some people would argue that a very old restoration work has an artistic value in its own right and should be kept part of the artwork. That's an ongoing debate. But here, look at Rubens's drawing. That hatching is insane. Okay, proper drawing. Rubens was extraordinary at drawing, amazing. Okay, so he's looking at the Laocoon, and you can see him using that right at the beginning of today's workshop as well. So in Spain, this is the first image of this painting we're going to look at. I'm going to show you a couple, and I'm going to show you another painting which relates to this, but you'll still be able to see this. And but this is the main subject for now. So this is something that you'll be able to draw really for a good length of time. We've got Democritus and Heraclitus here. painted in 1603, which was the year that Rubens went to Spain as a member of an embassy to Philip III, sent by Vincenzo Gonzaga, who was his employer since he arrived in Venice. When he arrived in Venice, he met the Duke of Mantua in Venice and entered his employ very, very swiftly. Because Vincenzo Gonzaga was looking for a court painter at that particular time, so it's a real convenient meeting. So in this painting, we can see him in a more mature and spontaneous way. I mean, this is one of his first really brilliant paintings, I think. I think this is a really brilliant painting because it's so Flemish and it's so northern, while integrating so much of what he's learning in Italy from Caravaggio and from the other Italian artists that he'd seen, and from the classical sculpture. So the head of Democritus is inclined and he's bearded and he is there seems to be a blushing sense to his face, and he could be modeled on the Laocoon, the head of the Laocoon. That expression and that tilt in the head, very much like the Laocoon in that sense, and also the open mouth, as though he's talking and engaging us. Heraclitus, on the other hand, is looking incredibly aged and morose and melancholy, and is very dark, and his face is in shadows. So looking at cast shadows on the face to enhance the dramatic impact and persona of the character, maybe he's integrating ideas from Caravaggio here at this stage as well. Okay, so we've got influence from Caravaggio as well as a Flemish influence. Depicting philosophers in this way with a globe was quite common and would become increasingly common throughout the 17th century with other artists like Hendrik ter Bruggen and Gerrit van Honthorst, who were heavily influenced by Caravaggio. They were the Dutch Caravaggisti, the Dutch painters who brought Caravaggio's influence to their native Netherlands, having visited Italy. So this is one of his early paintings from the opening years of the 17th century. And also we can really see a departure here. It's not manneristic, and it isn't necessarily really rooted in any of the, I mean, it isn't really in that manneristic school, and it isn't the sort of painting of a mythological or philosophical or genre type that you would expect to see by any of his teachers that we looked at last week. This is starting to become Rubens working in a more independent way and responding to the influences that he is seeing in a very autonomous way and in a very creative way, while adapting pre-established Flemish themes with those influences. Having Heraclitus, half of his face in shadow, and having the shadow really enhance the sense of mood and emotion and expression, is very influenced by Caravaggio, and also having this very close up intimate interaction with these two, as though we are being very much invited into their space to debate philosophy with them. This is the sort of thing that was becoming increasingly popular in Spain at this time as well. What's happening in this period, in the early 17th century, is that the merchant class was doing so well, and the urban educated classes were becoming increasingly literate and wanted to show their erudition. And there was the emergence of a type of painting that could be referred to as a conversation piece, something that would trigger or initiate interesting conversation within an environment, within a social environment or a household. It's also a new age of the private collection of paintings. As I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about Caravaggio, we have the emergence of a private open market, sorry, not a private market, but an open market where artworks could be purchased by private buyers for private collections on the open market. And so this sort of painting is within that context of this new type of painting, which is emerging in the opening years of the 17th century. However, with this particular painting, Rubens hasn't been commissioned for this, and he is painting this to fill a gap. And he uses ideas to execute this painting, which are partly fresh in his mind and partly drawn out of a deep reservoir of ideas which he's had for a long time. Okay, so the head of Democritus is very inspired by Laocoon. The head of Heraclitus is very inspired by something that he studied while he was an apprentice in Antwerp. Now, one thing I'd like to say before we look at what that little painting was, actually, well, I can just put it here. Okay, so you've still got the original painting, but above we've got Rubens's study of the Emperor Galba from 1600, or just before 1600, probably. Okay, so that's something he painted while he was in the workshop of Otto van Veen. And it's a study of a bust of the Emperor Galba. Okay, and on the left is the original painting. So we can see how he is. I mean, look at Heraclitus and how similar he is to Galba there. He's just adapted that pose. I mean, he would have had a folio of drawings. He wouldn't have had that painting with him. That painting, he wouldn't have been traveling with that painted study, but he would have traveled with sketchbooks and with a folio of drawings, which he would have then used to execute this painting, which he did in a very, very short space of time. Because what happened, Rubens was on his way to Spain, and he was in Spain. He was on his way to Valladolid in Spain to visit the court of the Spanish royal court, the court of Philip III, and the Duke of Lerma, who was a very, very important man in the Spanish court. And some of the paintings that they were taking with them were damaged. And they weren't Rubens's paintings, they were paintings by other artists who were that were damaged on their way, which were supposed to be presented as gifts. And what Rubens did is he painted a new painting between the 14th of June and the 6th of July, 1603, to replace a damaged painting and to present this as one of those gifts to the King of Spain. This painting earned him many commissions from the Duke of Lerma. So he very cleverly responded to this difficulty, this accident. Paintings that were supposed to be gifts for the King of Spain that were too damaged en route, and he replaced them with his own work, and that gained him a real advantage, a personal advantage for his professionally. Okay, so gifts from his employer, the Duke of Mantua, were damaged, and he replaced them with his own work, which he executed within a couple of weeks in June up until early July 1603. That's how quickly he painted this, and he would have used his drawings to do it. He would have used his drawings to do it. Okay, So here's that painting closer up for you to spend a bit more time capturing the expressions. And there's a lot to say about this painting. And he hasn't just drawn from his repertoire of images, his collection of his drawings from his folios. He's actually made them look like convincing real people. But he's adapted drawings that he already had with him to execute this painting. One of them looks like the Emperor Galba, the other one looks like the Laocoon. And he painted this while en route in a, probably what would have been a very makeshift studio in Spain within a couple of weeks. And so this challenge makes him experience or puts him on his way to becoming more creatively mature very quickly. It is so spontaneous. I mean, the whole story of doing this painting is so spontaneous. It's not like any story in the history of painting that I've ever heard. I mean, we do know of Velazquez painting the Fraga Philip in a small makeshift a makeshift studio on the edge of a battlefield over 3 sittings. That's comparable, but the story is quite different there. This is something that Rubens had an idea of doing. He had the idea of doing this to solve a problem and to execute something himself, which he could include in a gift to the King of Spain. This is very clever, professional sort of chess he's playing, you know, putting a real sort of big move in there, inserting one of his own works in this collection of gifts, which would boost his reputation. And that approach, that dynamism, that eclectic dynamism, or that dynamic eclecticism, that's something that is an example of dynamic eclecticism, being dynamic in that situation with your actions and decisions, and being able to execute something like this is one of the reasons that Rubens was so, mesmerizingly successful and became so remarkably famous in his lifetime. Now, if you look at the 2 faces, Democritus is very young or younger, and he looks very sanguineous in his blushing. He looks quite robust and he looks happy. He's often represented as the laughing philosopher because of his supposedly jovial sentiment, and found humanity a funny spectacle. Heraclitus, who, as we've already seen, based on a bust of the Roman Emperor Galba, which Rubens studied while he was still in Antwerp, looks far older and almost moribund. That sinking skin and the veins showing through underneath, whereas very different. 2 completely different visual effects with the same medium. Now, Leonardo had achieved that with his drawings. Think of that wonderful red chalk drawing of the young man and the old man face to face by Leonardo da Vinci. That, just with a piece of red chalk, he's created that real impression of age and youth on the same sheet of paper with the same material. That's something that's quite noticeable in this painting. And there's also the sense of discourse between the 2 subjects and us being involved in it. Obviously, I've moved us all closer to the subjects to give you more of a better view, but the painting itself invites that sense to it. It's also showing off some of his erudition. I made quite a fuss of his classical literary education, which he received up until he was 13 years old. He went to a school of Latin in Antwerp until he was 13. And here he's engaging in this ancient philosophical subject between Democritus and Heraclitus. Now, Democritus is one of the founders of the atomists school of ancient Greek thought. Now, atomism in ancient Greek philosophy really is the proposition that everything that exists is composed of atoms, too small to perceive and indivisible particles that they refer to as atoms. That everything that exists was made up of atoms. That the only things in existence were either atoms and empty space. This is what Democritus thought. And that is one of the ancient schools of Greek philosophy. Now, atomism, was influential on the formulation of Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus came sometime after Plato and Aristotle, in the century following them. And Epicureanism also advances the idea that everything comprises atoms and negative space, either atoms or negative space, and essentially that even the mind and the human passions is therefore a physical thing, a material thing, and that once you're dead and your soul is not, it's not essentially gone, but it's morphed into something else. Now, Heraclitus is one of the most famous pre-Socratic philosophers. These are both pre-Socratic philosophers who came before Socrates. And Heraclitus is the philosopher that is most widely credited for having said that it's impossible to stand in the same river twice because all of nature is constantly in flux. It's the flux theory of Heraclitus. Very influential ideas and very, very important for understanding the overall trajectory of ancient Greek thought, and because they bear a significant relation to the greats of ancient Greek philosophy, the two central figures being Plato and Aristotle. Plato didn't like Democritus, wanted him censored, and I'm not sure what he thought of Heraclitus, actually. I'm not sure what Plato thought of Heraclitus. But yeah, Plato and Aristotle were not afraid to critique their predecessors, and all philosophy engages with their predecessors. So, one example of a philosopher who dislikes basically every philosopher that came before him except for Spinoza would be Nietzsche. So Nietzsche thinks that the whole history of philosophy has got it wrong all the time from Plato. Plato was the originator of the ascetic ideal, according to Nietzsche, but he had a respect for Spinoza, and that's quite ironic because Spinoza I would have thought that Spinoza's ethics were rather effete from a Nietzschean point of view, but there'd probably be a very complex analysis to fully grasp what Nietzsche really thought of Spinoza. But so yeah, Democritus is a 4th century BCE philosopher. He was the student of Leucippus, who was a 5th century BCE. He was really the founder of atomism, the teacher of Democritus, Leucippus. And as I mentioned earlier, Epicurean thought follows in the atomists' proposition that all existence comprises atoms and the empty space in between them. So there, I mean, this painting I think is fantastic. It brings it all together for me, the dynamic eclecticism, because we have Laocoon, we have his training from Antwerp with his head of the Roman Emperor Galba, we have Caravaggio-esque elements with the chiaroscuro and with the realistic naturalism of the figures. We also have a literary you know, a literary theme or a philosophical theme, an erudite theme. And so it really is all there in such a simple, brilliant painting, which he painted in about a fortnight. You know, it's pretty remarkable, I think. So everybody, we do have time for one more painting, and I do hope you'll have a look at Samson and Delilah with me. So here we are, look at that. I mean, amazing, isn't it? So this is in the National Gallery. I'm very fortunate that I'm from London and live in London, and I've had many opportunities to stand in front of this painting and look at it quite a lot. One thing that I noticed immediately is that, you know, Titian is someone who's really made a big impression on him, and the reflections of light on the glass is something that Titian was really started doing. These little shimmers of white paint to create, you know, this just applied very quickly and with, you know, quite pastos application of white paint, which is just splashed on there like that. Lead white is an amazing paint to use because it kind of is quite a peculiar substance. When you agitate lead white paint, it kind of loosens up, and even if you don't add terps to it, moving it with the brush kind of loosens it, so you don't actually have to terps lead white down so much. And it's a very lean paint, doesn't require much oil to work into a paint film. So that use of lead white is you know, connected to Titian. But look at all the different light sources in this painting. This painting was intended to be hung above a fireplace as well. And so that's why we've got all of these naked flames. One of the reasons why we have these naked flames, there's a flame here, all the way back there below Venus and Cupid. Did you spot Venus and Cupid? We've got a candle there. We've got a fire here. And we've got a torches out there. So all of these different light sources. And that is so, I mean, that dynamic and very dynamic use of light to situate the painting in its own domestic context above a fireplace, but also to illuminate the composition and to enhance the visceral depth of the figurative description of the back of the hulking Samson. I mean, look at cast your mind back to the drawing of the Belvedere torso. I mean, that has influenced this, hasn't it? You know, this is about another variation of the Belvedere torso, but he's remembered that. He certainly thought of that while executing this. So Samson and Delilah from 1610, very big painting on a beautiful wooden panel. And tonal contrasts give a really great sense of dramatic intensity. Darkness of the background has an ominous feel to it. They're in the shadows, but they have torches with them. They're going to come in and they're going to seize Samson once he's had his haircut, and he's going to be a far weaker man. He won't be able to resist the arrest of the Philistines. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's also intended to be hung above a fireplace, his friend's fireplace, actually. So Nicholas Rocox was Rubens's friend who purchased this painting for him, and this was hung above his fireplace. And so there needed to be a degree of luminosity to the painting, because the flames would distort the light around this painting. And so the highlights really need to shine through that distortion. And for those highlights to really be highlights, they need to have deep contrasts. And the deep contrasts in light and shade, we think of Tintoretto and Caravaggio. So influence from those two painters. The highlights also really do illuminate the narrative. If you think of the light being cast onto Delilah, her upper body, her breasts, her face, her jaw, and then her gaze, the lightest part is her, and her gaze is down on him having his hair cut by that barber with a pair of scissors. the hands don't really have much of a poetic sense to them, like the Van Dyck Samson and Delilah painting that we looked at in part 1 of the Van Dyck workshop, which I didn't record, unfortunately. You'll have to wait for Van Dyck part 2. I'll have to maybe run through that again. A lot of the stuff from what was in Van Dyck was relevant when discussing part 1 of Rubens, especially on the background in Antwerp. And so if you didn't see the first workshop on Van Dyck, a lot of that context in Antwerp is covered in part 1 on Rubens. But I'll also be doing Van Dyck again in the future, and we'll use those notes so that nothing will ultimately be missed. So we've got, the hands are, they're conducting the action, but Delilah's hands are very, very passive, whereas they seem to actually communicate in the Van Dyck painting, which Van Dyck did when he was much younger than Rubens was when he did this. But he had this as a reference, you see. Van Dyck had this painting as a point of reference to build on, which he most certainly did. And of the two painters, I mean, I still prefer Van Dyck, but I don't think he's not the creative sort of, he's a poetic master. But what I've discovered in organizing these 3 workshops in this series on Rubens is that Rubens was an absolute powerhouse, a creative mammoth, and a genius, and an absolutely great one. But the hands are very passive on Delilah, and the hands of the barber are very descriptive and obvious because he's simply just cutting the hair. The light sources are very, very interestingly placed, and it does illuminate the narrative and also the anatomy of Samson. He is almost like an écorché, one of those flayed models of a flayed model to show the muscles. Okay, so we do have examples of écorché studies by Rubens in pen and ink, so he would have understood a lot about anatomy via them. But also the Belvedere torso, as I've mentioned, that huge hulking male body of really titanic strength. That's what he is expressing here in a way which is very sad, because that strength is in this very moment being taken away. Not that he wouldn't recover. 4 flames, 1, 2, 3, 4 flames are visible. This is amazing. So let me just show you that there's something very interesting here about the Venus and Cupid. Now, what on earth is, this is an Old Testament story, but we have a Venus and Cupid. Venus and Cupid. Venus, the goddess of love. Cupid, the personification of Eros. And these are Hellenic, pagan figures. And this is a Judeo-Christian narrative. This is a Hebrew story. And what on earth is there must be something, some reason why, or something in the narrative, and I think I've discovered what it might be. Okay, so if we take a little closer look at the Venus and Cupid, if you don't mind, look at that. Quite nicely done for a background. But look, Cupid has got his mouth bound. It's almost as though Venus is telling him, shh, cover your mouth, don't say anything. He's trying to get up to, he's sort of on tippy toes, trying to say something, but he's got his mouth bound so that he can't speak, because maybe Cupid wants to warn Samson and stop this awful thing from happening to him. So look, there we are, and then there, and I did also do a closer one for you. There you are. So you can look at the back anatomy a little bit more. Okay, everyone. So have you all enjoyed the workshop today? Anyone got any questions or comments they'd like to make?
No, it was fantastic, particularly the Belvedere.
Yeah, good. You enjoyed it, David, did you?
Definitely did.
Fantastic.
Why is it, Jonathan, in Samson and Delilah's paintings, why is it she's always got her breasts out?
Rubens was quite famous for that. I don't know if she's always got her breasts out. She doesn't in. She does. I think they. I don't think she does always. She doesn't in Caravaggio's. She doesn't in Caravaggio's one.
Oh, right.
So always is maybe a bit strong, but in Baroque painting,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, male nudes, female nudes are everywhere.
Yeah.
Especially after Giorgione. I mean, oh no, maybe does Caravaggio do a Samson and Delilah? I'm thinking of Judith and Holofernes by Caravaggio. I'm not sure that Caravaggio has a Samson and Delilah. Maybe he doesn't. Well, I shall find out, won't I? Because next week we're doing Caravaggio, and we're going to have an absolutely wild time, everyone. So yeah, the Judith and Holofernes, she doesn't have her breasts out, which is disappointing. But so we that's okay. Yeah, I'm not sure about always.
No.
Always. No, I don't. Yeah.
I think Rubens is very good at marketing himself, wasn't he?
Incredible.
Probably one of the first very good marketers.
There may have been some pretty good marketers before, and yeah, Leonardo was quite a good self-promoter.
Yeah.
Self-promoter. I'll create machines for you that will help you destroy any opponent, he said to Ludovico Sforza, before he even mentioned that he was a pretty good artist. So everyone, what happens now? So we're in 1610 with Rubens. This is a painting from 1610, and that is the culmination of the series. What happens after in Rubens's career is completely unbelievable. He becomes by far the most important painter of the 17th century, essentially, and has a huge impact on painting and its development into the 18th century and onwards. He's not in fashion at the moment. Not many people are very interested in Rubens at the moment, which is quite peculiar, but I mean, we all have to be aware of him because he's just, you know, such a huge part of our tradition. And through understanding more about people who are, you know, one of us in this tradition of art and painting and drawing, you know, a part of our broader kind of our you know, our group, it gives us more self-understanding about our potential and what has shaped how we perceive and how we understand things by looking at how artists have grappled with things in the past. So thank you very much. That's the end of the series on Rubens. I can't believe it. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I can't wait to do Caravaggio with you all next week. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you all next time. And I'm just going to stop the recording because then we can look at each other's artwork.